Human blood sprayed across alien mandibles as Private Walter Thomas fired his flechette rifle into the advancing Unas, the oversized insects swarming his unit's entrenched position. With a savage war cry on his lips, Walter fought like he was possessed, ejecting a spent heatsink and ramming in a fresh one, before opening fire again on the chittering horde. The tang of ozone and bowels hit Walter's nostrils as he mowed down 3 more of the bastards in a furious full-auto burst, their smoking husks littering the killing field. The Unas' assault had gone on for 12 sleepless days and nights now, plasma and metal flying without end, as the alien General Vox drove his numerically superior forces towards the human perimeter again and again. Walter's platoon was all that stood between the Unas swarm and 50,000 defenseless human colonists, their ammo and stims almost gone. The determined grunts were caked with so much grime that their powered combat armor looked like sculptures of dried mud, every plate scarred by near misses. Walter's bones ached, and the space behind his eyes was a dull throb. Vox's strategy was clear as day: throw bodies at the human position until something broke. 10 or 20 or 50 Unas might fall to every human, for the diminutive bipeds were taking a savage toll, but eventually exhaustion would end the stalemate. If the line failed here, there wasn't another for 50 kilometers, and if the Unas got into the colony, Walter knew firsthand what the insectoids would do to human civilians. Just the thought of Unas' mercies made his finger twitch against the rifle's trigger. The colonists had come to this rock, seeking a new beginning, not to end up as a butcher's feast. As the Unas closed to within a dozen paces, Walter's jaw tightened. His buddies crouched on his left and right, rifles leveled in steady grips. No matter how many Xenos they swept away with massed fire, more surged forward. Soon the aliens would overrun their position with raw numbers. They'd have to be pushed back in brutal CQC, or the colony was doomed. Walter turned to the soldier next to him and nodded grimly, slapping a fresh magazine home into his rifle. The Unas were about to learn what human soldiers did to threats at close range. They weren't going to like the lesson. Walter sighted down his rifle at a massive Unas warrior barreling towards him, the creature's exoskeleton gleaming in the harsh light. He squeezed the trigger, bullets pinging off the alien's natural armor. The warrior closed the distance in a few powerful strides, scythe-like claws shearing through the ceramic plates of Walter's combat suit. He felt the sting as his skin split under the assault. Dropping his rifle, Walter drew his combat knife from its sheath. He ducked under a vicious swipe and drove the blade into a gap between the warrior's thoracic plates. The Unas screeched, ichor spraying from the wound as it reeled back. Walter's moment of victory was cut short by a searing pain. His left shoulder erupted in agony, and he staggered back, falling into the trench. A plasma bolt had found its mark. His vision swam and darkened at the edges. Sound became muffled, distant. Through the haze he saw a towering figure emerge from the Unas line, ornate armor adorning its body, scars of battle etched into the plates. General Vox, leader of the swarm. The Unas parted before Vox like water before the prow of a ship. Vox's cold alien eyes surveyed the battle, mandibles twitching. Disgust radiated from the general at the human's continued defiance. Vox spat a series of clicks and chatters, a guttural language of war. The Unas' ranks swelled with newfound ferocity as they surged forward. Walter struggled to rise to rejoin the fight, but a strong hand held him down. Sergeant Marcus, face streaked with grime, leaned over him. The sergeant tore a field dressing from his pack and pressed it against Walter's wound. "Easy, soldier," Marcus growled. "We're not done yet. The colonel's got a plan." Walter gritted his teeth, the pain threatening to overwhelm him. What plan could overcome these odds? As if in answer, a deep rhythmic roar filled the air, growing louder each second. The Unas faltered, their advance slowing. They turned to face this new threat. Walter peered over the lip of the trench. What he saw sent a chill through him, even as it sparked a desperate hope. A line of hulking vehicles roared into view, kicking up clods of mud as their treads chewed through the battlefield. Experimental tanks, armed to the teeth with advanced plasma cannons, and shielded by energy fields that shimmered like heat mirages. The cavalry had arrived. Colonel Briggs's voice burst from the comms. "All units, this is Colonel Briggs. The cavalry has arrived. Prepare to advance on my mark." The tanks smashed into the Unas like fists, pulse blasts and searing plasma bolts tearing through the aliens, leaving maimed and scorched bodies in their wake. The Unas fired back in a frenzy, but their shots sizzled against unyielding energy shields. General Vox saw his forces crumpling into chaos, mandibles flaring out. Vox howled with rage. The general charged at the closest tank, power blade ablaze with violent energies. Vox sprang up onto the tank's hull, stabbing his blade into its shields. The energy field crackled and died. The tank's turret whirled to aim at the general, pulse cannon whining, but Vox was faster, twisting out of the way of the shots. His power blade flashed as he hacked into the tank's ceramite plating. Walter watched in dread from the trench as the general ripped the war machine apart, metal screaming as the general's blade sheared through it. "All remaining units, concentrate fire on the general's position," Colonel Briggs ordered over comms. "Buy our forces time to regroup and prepare for a counterattack." The remaining tanks and soldiers turned their weapons on Vox, a hail of gunfire and energy blasts converging on the general. Despair gripped Walter. Even if they brought Vox down, the Unas would not stop until every human on this planet was slaughtered. They might be winning this battle, but this war was not over. Not by a long shot. The combined fire of the tanks and soldiers hammered into General Vox, his ornate armor fracturing under the onslaught. Shards of shattered chitin sprayed out in all directions. But the general stood firm, eyes blazing with fanatical rage, mandibles flared. Vox leapt down from the ruined tank, power blade humming, and charged straight at the human lines. The blade carved a molten path through the muddy ground, leaving glowing gashes in its wake. "All units fall back to secondary defensive positions," Colonel Briggs ordered over the comms. "Walter, Marcus, take your squad and flank the general. Draw his fire." Walter signaled his squad and they crept out, moving from cover to cover through the tangled wreckage of the battlefield. Scorched Una's corpses and torn metal littered the ground. A glint of metal caught Walter's eye. He reached down and pulled a prototype plasma rifle from the mud. It must have been dropped by some unfortunate soldier. Walter checked the charge, still half full. He hefted the rifle and peered around a shattered chunk of ceramite. General Vox strode through the smoke, armor pitted and cracked, still coming. Walter raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel. At this range, the superheated plasma might just burn through the general's cracked armor. A shadow fell over Walter. He whirled. General Vox loomed above him, power blade raised high. Walter rolled aside as the blade slashed down in a crackling arc. Mud sizzled where he'd been a heartbeat before. Walter came up in a crouch and fired. A searing plasma bolt took Vox in the chest. The general staggered back, armor smoking and running like molten wax, but still Vox did not fall. With an ear-splitting roar, Vox lunged at Walter, blade tipped forward to impale him. Walter froze. This was it. He'd always known it would end this way on some nameless battlefield far from home. He closed his eyes. The blow never landed. Walter's eyes snapped open. Sergeant Marcus stood over him, the edge of his own power blade locked against the general's. The two warriors strained against each other, servos whining, blades casting eerie shadows in the smoke. Marcus kicked out, catching the general in the abdomen. Vox hissed in fury as he stumbled back. Walter scrambled to his feet, raising the rifle once more. Marcus and Vox circled each other, blades weaving and sparking as they clashed again and again. Walter tried to draw a bead on the general, but the two combatants moved too quickly, darting in and out of his sights. Suddenly Vox feinted left. Marcus moved to block, but too late. The general's blade slipped past the sergeant's guard and bit deep into his side, cleaving through armor and flesh. Marcus cried out in pain and fell to one knee, bright blood spilling out to stain the mud. Vox raised his blade for the killing blow. Time seemed to slow. Walter breathed out, finger tightening on the trigger. The plasma bolt leapt from the rifle's barrel, searing through the air. It struck Vox's blade, shearing it in half in a burst of blinding light. The general stumbled back, mandibles slack with shock as he stared at the molten stump of his blade. Marcus, teeth gritted against the pain, surged to his feet. He rammed his own blade up under the general's shattered breastplate. The tip burst from Vox's back in a spray of ichor. Vox convulsed, hands scrabbling weakly at the blade impaling him. Then, with a final shudder, he fell still. Marcus wrenched his blade free, and Vox's lifeless body collapsed to the ground. The sergeant turned to Walter, blood still seeping from the gash in his side. "Good shot, Private," Marcus said, his voice strained. "Thought I was done for." Walter hurried forward, slinging the plasma rifle over his shoulder. He pulled a field dressing from his pack and pressed it to Marcus's wound. Around them the battle still raged. The tanks and soldiers pushed forward, blasting away at the Una's ranks. Without General Vox to lead them, the aliens fell into disarray, skittering back before the human advance. "We've got them on the run," Marcus said, looking out over the battlefield. "But this is far from over. Vox was just one general. There will be others to take his place." Walter nodded, a grim set to his jaw. They had won the day, but at a steep cost. And Marcus was right. The Unas would not stop, not until every last human on this planet was dead or enslaved. This was only the beginning. Marcus and Vox clashed in a whirlwind of slashing blades, darting and lunging across the churned mud. Walter hauled himself up, snatching the plasma rifle. He swung it to his shoulder, sighting on the dueling figures. Walter's finger hovered over the trigger. At this range, a plasma bolt would punch through ceramite like it was paper, but Vox and Marcus were moving so fast, grappling and striking. If he missed... Marcus's boots skidded on a shard of metal. The sergeant stumbled, thrown off balance for a split second. It was enough. Vox's power blade flashed forward, stabbing through Marcus's breastplate and into his heart. The blade burst out Marcus's back in a spray of blood. Marcus stiffened, shock in his eyes. His power blade slipped from his fingers. His legs buckled and he fell, Vox's blade still buried in his chest. Walter screamed, a primal howl of grief and rage. He squeezed the trigger. The plasma bolt leapt from the barrel, searing across the battlefield. It struck Vox in the head, in a burst of blinding light. The general's helmet shattered. Shards of chitin sprayed out, mixed with ichor and bits of pulped flesh. Vox swayed, his mangled head lolling. Then he toppled backward and crashed to the ground, limbs splayed at impossible angles. Cheers erupted from the human lines. Soldiers pumped their fists in the air, hugging each other. The Unas were scattering, fleeing in complete disarray with their leader dead. But Walter felt no elation as he stumbled to Marcus and fell to his knees in the bloody muck. He pulled the sergeant into his lap, cradling his head. Marcus' eyes were already glassing over. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak. "Walter, did we—" "We got him," Walter choked out. "Vox is dead. We won." A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's face. Then he shuddered and went still, a last breath sighing from his lungs. Around Walter, the battle still raged. The Unas fought with the desperate savagery of a broken enemy. Pulse rounds and plasma bolts crisscrossed the field, soldiers and aliens alike falling. Colonel Briggs's voice crackled over the comm. "All units, press the attack. Drive the bastards back to their ships. The day is ours, but this war ain't over by a long shot." Walter laid Marcus down gently and stood. His eyes were hard as flint. Marcus was gone. So many others were gone, humans and Unas both, this killing field soaked with their mingled blood. But the colony was safe for now. The civilians would live, and Walter would fight on in the memory of those who'd given everything for that cause. He raised the plasma rifle and charged into the fray, a battle cry on his lips. Pulse bolts and plasma shots blazed around him. An Unas loomed up before him, screeching in rage and fear, slashing with barbed talons. Walter dodged the blow and jammed his rifle barrel up under the creature's chin. He pulled the trigger, and the Una's head vanished in a flash of searing light. As the smouldering corpse collapsed, Walter was already moving, vaulting over the body and racing on, firing from the hip. He could hear Marcus in his mind, barking orders, urging him forward. Walter would never forget his sergeant's voice, or his sacrifice. The war would go on. Walter would carry these scars, these memories, for the rest of his days. But so long as he drew breath, he would keep fighting. For the colony. For his fallen comrades. For the unbreakable human spirit that even the Unas could never conquer. The battle raged around Walter as he plunged into the enemy ranks, plasma rifle blazing in his hands. Its shots joined by the fire of the human soldiers surging forward alongside him, the Unas falling back before their fierce assault. Vox was dead, but the war was far from over. So Walter fought on through blood and mud, and the cries of the wounded and dying beneath the smoke-filled alien sky. He fought for all he had lost, and all that he swore to protect. He fought for hope, even in the darkness of this bitter war. And he would keep fighting, until the last shot was fired and the last Unas lay dead. That was a promise to his fallen friend, and to himself. A promise forged in blood and tears, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. Walter charged on, his rifle hot in his hands, its energy cell nearly spent. But he would not stop, he could not stop. The battle still called, and he would answer, for as long as he drew breath. For this was a soldier's duty, a soldier's creed. If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.